So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning, my dear colleagues to the left, to the right. Yes, we're just waiting until everyone had a seat, so fine. Yeah, my ladies and gentlemen, my distinguished guest here in the panel, it's a great honor. Thank you, Miguel, for making it possible, and also, of course, a great pleasure to welcome you here at the Bonn Climate Change Conference, and especially to our discussion advancing the Sustainable Development Goals in the context of voluntary climate protection projects. My name is Peter Renner. I'm the chairman of the board of the directors of the Foundation Development and Climate Alliance based in Berlin. And within this event, we want to discuss with you, ladies and gentlemen, so please feel free to ask questions, may raise your hands even during the discussion. I will act then responsibly. Discuss how avoiding and reducing greenhouse gas emissions can be successfully combined with the use of carbon markets. For example, for compensation of non-avoided emissions to drive not only decarbonization, but also to provide additional benefits by contribution to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Using concrete examples, that's the question indeed. The event also discussed the challenge for the voluntary carbon market against the background of the current state of Article 6, and so far I'm very happy to welcome Mr. Lambert Schneider. I will introduce my colleagues then just directly afterwards. Our speakers are renowned experts in their fields who will give an overview of the current market, discuss its strengths and weaknesses, and show approaches to ensure quality of the voluntary carbon market, new and additional standards and initiatives. Let me introduce my guests, and I may begin with in a certain sense, our landlord here, Miguel Naranjo. He worked as process engineer and environmental supervisor for a transnational corporation and later joined the United Nations Environment Programme in the climate change team. He joined the UN Climate Change Secretariat in 2011, where he was focused in capacity building for mitigation and carbon markets mechanism, promotion of climate action among the private sector and other stakeholders, and development of tools to implement climate action. And he will talk about the carbon markets, benefits and expectation under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. To my right, I may very warm welcome Femke. She is leading the development and implementation of the global program of wetland carbon for Wetlands International's office network that is active in over 20 countries worldwide. She has over 20 years experience in nature conservation and restoration in the context of climate change mitigation and adaptation. She advocates for nature-based solutions in close cooperation with government agencies, knowledge institutes, private sector, NGOs, and last but not least, communities. Her input today is about unlocking carbon finance for wetlands while ensuring social environmental integrity. A very warm welcome also to my direct right side, to Lambert Schneider. He is research coordinator for international climate policy at the Oeko-Institut in Freiburg, Germany. He has been doing research on carbon markets for the last 20 years and is involved in the negotiation on Article 6 on stateside. He is also a member of the CDM Executive Board and co-chair of the expert panel of the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. He will present us today the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative and new research on the sustainable development impacts of the voluntary carbon market projects. Last but not least, to my very left side, Juan Pablo Solís Vizquez is an economist holding a Magister of Science in Economy Policy with minor in Electrical Economy and Sustainable Development. He has a lot of experience in human rights, gender, value chain, green businesses, landscape restoration, microfinance, and sustainable development goals, and more than 15 years experience of working experience strengthening capacity with vulnerable people in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Rim. He will give us an insight into Fairtrade climate standard and opportunity of increasing transparency and sustainable development contributions through the whole carbon market. Ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned, I'm working for the Foundation Development and Climate Alliance. What is that we do, and why do we bring our distinguished guest to this table today? Government efforts are not enough, and we require additional commitment by non-state, non-public, respective private actors and the whole private sector. That's why the BMZ, the Federal German Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, has funded the Development and Climate Alliance, which was transferred into a designated foundation in 2020. The foundation promotes carbon offsetting in addition to avoidance of greenhouse gas emissions by contributing at the same time to the achievement of the United Nations Agenda 2030, the SDGs. It enables access to a wide range of sustainable projects in developing and emerging countries, the countries in the global south, which implement highest ranked standards and support climate action and development in the respective countries. Companies, institutions, municipalities, private individuals can improve their climate footprint by becoming climate neutral more quickly, while at the same time helping to implement the sustainable development goals in the global south. We support all actors on their way. We are a platform. Today already speaking for more than 1,250 supporters. There's a number of measures and services we offer, technical-wise, media-wise, political networking, advocacy, agenda setting, etc., etc., which eventually shall strengthen the market and support with implementation of the Paris Agreement and the Agenda 2030. So we can also only encourage you to join our mission, become climate neutral, and support the sustainable development goals in our partner countries. Without further ado, it is now my pleasure and hand over the floor to our first speaker. Miguel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So yes, I'm not the landlord, but I'm kind of hosting the association, the foundation today. So thank you, Peter, and welcome everyone. So I have the easy part of the session today, which is just to provide an introduction to the carbon markets and why carbon markets. I'm assuming that most of you already know this. I'm preaching to the choir, but just to set the scene and remind us all why we are still talking about this, why it is important. So if you go to the next, thank you, Jan. Reasons for the carbon markets. Initially, the main reason why they were set up was to find most cost-efficient ways to reduce or avoid greenhouse gas emissions. Right? Go to the projects and to the nations where the cost for abatement of emissions was lower. In the end, the atmosphere doesn't really care where the emissions are being produced or avoided. What matters is that total emissions are reduced. So this is why the carbon markets were seen as a tool to go where it was cheaper to reduce towards the global goal. Now, in addition to, of course, helping as a tool to mobilize finance to make happen projects that reduce, avoid, capture emissions, they also bring other sustainable development benefits. And that's one of the focuses of our colleagues here from the foundation. It's not only about the mitigation, it's also about the benefits that it brings to local communities and to other nations. So you have, of course, the social, economic, and environmental benefits that different types of projects may have. Now, we will hear more about how to assess this and how to ensure that this is done transparently, credibly. But in principle, a project that is well implemented has a big potential or may have a big potential to contribute to these additional sustainable development benefits. Now, in practice, what we see is that organizations use this compensation of emissions through carbon credits as a way to put a price on carbon, right? It's like operationalizing an internal price of carbon. I can speak from the experience of the UN, the United Nations. The 68 different organizations that today make the UN system, they are compensating their emissions to claim carbon neutrality. And what happens in practice is that they have to look for mechanisms to ensure that they will have the budget at the end of the day to be able to compensate for non-avoided emissions, therefore triggering a whole discussion about the need to, first of all, reduce or avoid the emissions so that later on you will need a lower budget, which needs to come from our member states, of course, to compensate those emissions. So it becomes a tool to raise awareness. So it's an internal carbon price, raises awareness among staff, but also among management, and then drives the discussion to try to avoid emissions in the first place, right? Because it might be cheaper than compensating at the end. So it's a way to put a price on carbon, is applying the well-known principle of the polluter pays. And finally, it's about implementing collaboration as well. These projects require many different parties to make them happen. So it's, in practice, a collaboration. In the case of the CDM, it was a first of its kind carbon market mechanism to be applied globally, as never before, right? You had a UN organization supporting the implementation of the mechanism under the guidance of parties. Lambert is one of our bosses. But you had also the national government involved in the conversation, private sector, which in most cases was developing the projects, providing the finance. So you have a multitude of stakeholders participating in a global collaboration to reduce greenhouse gases. Now we will hear more about how successful it was and how credible, but in principle, it was a mechanism that drove collaboration to reduce emissions. So that's also the multilateralism of that is also very important. Next, please. Then expectations under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So we are at the very early stage, and here also Lambert will know much better than me. But in general, what we might expect to see is now that those carbon credits that will be correspondingly adjusted, that will be authorized by governments, since they will need to be reflected in the host country greenhouse gas inventory, increasing that inventory, we might see less interest or less willingness to authorize projects than what we saw in the CDM, right? In the CDM, the host countries, in this case, only developing countries, they were not required to adjust their greenhouse gas inventories. Now they are. So we might see a little bit less willingness to approve these correspondingly adjusted carbon credits or units. In addition, that or in consequence, that might bring lower supply, and therefore higher prices for carbon credits. Higher prices we are seeing already today in the market for many different reasons, but the expectation that there might be less supply from these mechanisms will or could also drive prices up. Then you know that then there will be some units that will be authorized or correspondingly adjusted and those that will not. So there is also an expectation that the ones that will not be correspondingly adjusted will fetch a lower price than the other ones, because the other ones will have potentially higher credibility. Even when they are all being developed under the same general rules, the fact that they are not being reflected in a national inventory might affect also their pricing. And finally, you know that we have Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement, where governments may decide bilaterally on or in groups of parties to implement their own mechanisms. And then you have 6.4, which is the centralized mechanism under a supervisory body. We will have to see how much preference governments will have for going for one or the other, right? Or stakeholders also in general will have for one of the other. Good. Then the next one, lessons learned. I mentioned CDM. There is also, of course, the voluntary markets. All of them have taught us a lot of lessons that hopefully are being now reflected under Article 6, and Lambert will refer also to voluntary markets. So, but in general, we understand now that there are two sides to the coin. One is the quality of the supply of the carbon credits, and this is where the environmental integrity, the transparency of the mechanisms is very important. But then there is also the other side of the coin, the use of those carbon credits, including the claims that are used. The concept of carbon neutrality or climate neutrality, now net zero, with the confusion that, that most people out there have about what's the difference between all of them, the fact is that they have become well known by the public. So they are driving demand for carbon credits. But the problem is sometimes that the claims associated to the use of those carbon credits, even if the carbon credits are completely credible, the claims may not be. So we have to understand now that we have to work on both the credibility of the projects and the units that they generate, but also the credibility of the calculation of the footprint and the claims of compensation of that footprint by the users. In terms of the Paris Agreement, there are rules for national governments, of course, for the use of units. On the voluntary side, progress still needs to continue being made. ISO is working on a carbon neutrality standard, and there is already thoughts on a net zero one. There are other initiatives that are ongoing in parallel to try to ensure the credibility of those claims. But in any case, we need both sides of the coin to have a successful use of carbon markets. Next one, please. The last slide, carbon markets are here to stay, right? The Paris Agreement has provisions for it. The voluntary market is going strong. As I mentioned, people are already familiar with claims of carbon neutrality or similar, net zero, etc. So they are going to stay here. What matters now is that we put in place the right systems and the right tools to ensure that both the supply and the claims associated to the use are credible and transparent. And I think that's where my colleagues here in the table are going to be very, very useful, because they will refer to that. And that's it from my side. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you, Miguel, for this interesting insight. And Femke, I may now hand over to you and give us your inside point of view from wetlands.
Thank you. Is this working? Yeah. A bit closer. Thank you for the opportunity to present today and for your attention as well. I'm going to talk about unlocking carbon finance for wetlands while also ensuring socio-environmental integrity. That's also Miguel mentioned. But first, a bit more about my organization. Wetlands International is a global organization. We already exist since 1995 as one organization, but have many predecessors in country that have been there for decades, working with governments, local communities, and other organizations. Our mission is to mobilize society to restore and safeguard wetlands for people and nature. And we are organized in 3 different impact areas, among which healthy wetlands and biodiversity, community resilience, and reduced climate risk. And we work in 3 different streams: peatlands, deltas and coasts, and rivers and lakes, because wetlands are those places where land and water meet. And those are exactly the places where you find the highest abundance of biodiversity, also highest numbers of people and often vulnerable people. So these are incredibly important ecosystems, and they play a role, especially when there is too much water or when there is too little water, in buffering water streams, for example. But they also store a lot of carbon. And of course, if we want to meet the 1.5 degree target, there is much awareness now that we need drastic emission reductions, but we also need removals. And nature-based solutions are key in that aspect, especially the wetlands that store huge amounts of carbon. For example, coastal ecosystems, they are vast carbon sinks, unless they are degraded. This picture shows that the mangroves and tidal marshes and seagrasses, they store up to 5 times more than tropical forests, and that is because they have huge sinks below ground in the sediments and soils. And these stocks keep on building up over time. For example, mangroves, they keep on trapping sediment, and in that sediment, they keep on storing carbon. But still, despite this importance, they are being lost. These ecosystems are being lost quite strongly, and we need to protect them. Also, peatlands are huge carbon stores, and if they are degraded, they release greenhouse gases. And peatland degradation causes up to 5% of global emissions, and that doesn't take into account peatland fires. That's only just blocking drainage for agricultural system. That's a huge amount, and that can be peatlands can be restored by re-wetting. Yes. So wetlands are also important for almost all SDGs. The arrows show where they are most important. They are important for, of course, water systems, climate adaptation, mitigation, food security, and more. So it's clear that it's really urgent to finance and to restore and conserve wetlands, and that also requires unprecedented funding. And that needs to be a combination of public and private funding. It can never be only public funding, it can never be only private funding, it has to be a combination. And we now see the growing voluntary markets opening up and paving the way for nature-based solutions. And so we think voluntary markets are a great opportunity also for wetland conservation and restoration. These markets potentially pave the way for compliance markets that will become bigger. For example, you now see Corsia, that's a hybrid market. And of course, also in the CDM, there were some nature-based solutions, but not to the extent that we actually needed. These voluntary markets can also directly support nationally determined contributions of countries, while also at the same time contributing to corporate targets, if that's communicated transparently. And when they are carried out well, they can provide benefits for people and nature. As Miguel mentioned already, carbon markets are, it's really crucial that they are that they operate in a responsible way, both socially and environmentally. And we need to secure that both on the supply side and on the demand side. On the supply side, that means ensuring high-quality projects that do deliver benefits for nature and people. And for businesses, that also implies deep decarbonization while also offsetting residual emissions. So there can be no greenwashing. Next. So to summarize, to ensure social environmental integrity, we need both on the supply side and on the demand side high quality. Yeah. And what does that mean? So we see that over the last 2 decades, I think there has been a lot of attention on the quality of supply. There are these different standards, Verra, Plan Vivo, CCBA, Gold Standard. And these have focused on elements that are important. Additionality, transparent and credible baselines, ensuring permanence, leakage, protecting biodiversity, respecting rights, of course, of local people and indigenous peoples, and also working at the right scale. From our perspective, robust standards have emerged, and as an organization, we have also contributed to various standards. We have worked on the IPCC supplement for wetlands, and we've also contributed to Verra methodologies. So for wetlands, we think this can be done in a good way. And we continue to adhere to and contribute to developing these standards. Next. And there are new initiatives emerging, like the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, like my neighbor, and others. Yeah. On the supply side, on the demand side, it's a bit more complicated. So the discussion, I think, has been out there for longer, but standards haven't materialized in the same way as the supply side quality. And we think it's really necessary to set science-informed targets, to make sure there is a roadmap with milestones on the way to achieving those targets, and then follow a mitigation hierarchy, starting with accounting, avoiding, reducing, and then offsetting, and maybe even going beyond that towards net positive impact. And from our perspective, offsetting is a part of the mitigation hierarchy and has to run in parallel. So these residual emissions are there at any moment in time. We hope they decrease drastically. But if we wait until everything else has been done, maybe that takes 10 years, then it will be too late to restore and conserve the wetlands that we actually need. So guidance is only just emerging and hotly debated, and we hope to help and test out this guidance. Yep. So there is now this new initiative called Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Council, but there's also the Science-Based Target Initiative, the Race to Zero, and many more. Yeah. Lastly, we just launched our paper that presents and discusses this in much more depth, also reflecting on Article 6 and the role of voluntary carbon markets in there. And you can find our report online. Thank you.
Thank you, Femke. And Lambert, I may now hand over to you, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Lambert Schneider. I work with Oeko-Institut, and I will have basically 2 presentations. So first of all, I will introduce the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative, which was initiated by WWF, Environmental Defense Fund, and Oeko-Institut, and which aims to bring transparency on the quality side. So we are not addressing the demand side, but the quality side, to provide transparency on that. And then I will present some research findings which we conducted with the Foundation Climate and Development and Climate Alliance. I'm always struggling with the name. About the sustainable development impacts. So what is the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative? So we see that voluntary carbon markets are emerging, but that it's very difficult for many buyers to navigate the market and to understand what are the different features, quality features of carbon credits. And so therefore we initiated this initiative with the idea of providing more transparency. And how do we do that? We provide scores for different types of carbon credits. And by doing so, we try to provide a nuanced picture, like what are the risks of different types of mitigation activities, different types of carbon credits, where can I be sure that it's good in quality, but where there are higher risks. And by that, we want to provide independent information and set incentives for different actors in the carbon credit market to improve the quality over time. So we target buyers who can kind of look, okay, what may be a good carbon credit, but also we target carbon crediting programs, project developers, etc., by providing this information. So how do we do that? Next slide, please. So we have 7 quality objectives, and then under each quality objective, we have many criteria and sub-criteria, etc. So of course, we look in the robust determination of the greenhouse gas emissions impact. We look at double counting, addressing non-permanence, facilitating transition towards net zero emissions. We evaluate the institutional arrangements and processes of carbon crediting programs, for example, how they do third-party auditing, how transparent they are. We look at environmental and social impacts, what safeguards the programs have in place, what are the typical co-benefits from projects, etc. And also for units that are authorized for Article 6 purposes, we look at the host country ambition because that's kind of a backstop safeguard. So here's kind of how it's organized. So we have these quality objectives. This is the first quality objective, and then under that we have different criteria like additionality or how the emission reductions are quantified, and then we have sub-criteria and sometimes many indicators. So we really look into the details of the carbon crediting programs, how they work, for example, how they address existing laws and regulations, are they considered in additionality testing or not, as an example. Next slide. Then we use a scoring from 1 to 5, and maybe that's a difference to the ICVCM, to the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, which will establish a threshold standard and will say, okay, these are carbon credits which have sufficient quality. Like what we do is more, we try to provide a nuanced picture and saying, okay, this carbon credit is really good in this area, but it's more moderate in this area and poorer in that area, because what we observe is it's never black and white, right? And so we try to provide a nuanced picture. Currently we have a limited scope. We have assessed 4 carbon crediting programs, the 4 biggest one, Verified Carbon Standard, Gold Standard, CDM, Climate Action Reserve, and we have assessed 3 project types, afforestation, landfill gas utilization, and efficient cook stoves. And then we have evaluated different methodologies. We have looked deeper in certain countries, etc. Next slide. So now I will illustrate a few findings just very briefly. So overall, what we find is that both for the carbon credits and for the carbon crediting programs that we see kind of a mixed performance. And so what I found interesting is that for each carbon crediting programs, we saw really, really good approaches, but also mixed approaches. And if the carbon crediting programs would kind of adopt always the best from their peers, I think that would already be a quite big step forward. So it's not that they need to do everything different than they did, but many carbon crediting programs are already good in some areas. Next slide. So here are some examples. Maybe I will not go into all of that. Maybe I pick here the first one. So for example, there are differences how existing legal requirements are considered in assessing additionality. Some carbon crediting standards for certain project types, they don't have any check whether there are laws and regulations requiring the activity. Then there are some which check that at project start and the renewal of the crediting period, which is a quite reasonable approach. But then there are also some who check that at each issuance, right? And so that gives a higher level of assurance of meeting that. Next slide. Okay, I will now show, here's a short video, how it works. So we have this website where we have this scoring tool. And so you can basically select a project type. So here landfill gas is selected, there are different prompts. Then you would kind of select between the carbon crediting program, which you have at hand here. And then there are a few other questions which are being selected, like where the project is being implemented, which methodology is used, when the emission reductions occurred. And then you get this scorecard, right, where you see, okay, these are our 7 quality objectives and how this type of carbon credit performs. And then you can zoom in and see even all the sub-criteria and more detail, like what scores well and what does not score so well, etc. And maybe what's important here is we don't assess specific carbon credits, right? We assess types of carbon credits. And so this is more a risk tool, and individual projects may still kind of defer or deviate from that. So last slide here very quickly. Sorry, if you can go back. Just what we are doing next. So we have a limited scope now, but we have now 5 more project types in the pipeline. We also assess standards like SDG Star, who focus particularly on co-benefits, etc. So we plan to amend this over time because currently it still has kind of limited applicability. Okay, and the second part, I hope it doesn't take too long. I will try to be fast, quick. The second part of my presentation is about the SDG benefits, the study which we conducted for the foundation. So basically we conducted 2 studies. On the left-hand side, that was the first part of the study. There we looked at different carbon crediting programs, and we evaluated 2 aspects. One is how do they ensure environmental and social safeguards, like how many do they check, how do they ensure that? And then also how do they assess sustainable development impacts, like co-benefits, are they monitored, etc. So the first part of the study was the focus on carbon crediting programs. And then in the second part of the study, we evaluated the typical benefits on the SDG goals. So we used the SDG frameworks of 4 selected project types, and we did that together with Stockholm Environment Institute. So here's an example of the evaluation of the environmental and social safeguards. So we picked basically, this is not a complete picture, but it's just part of it. We picked kind of 10 criteria, which we thought, okay, these are really important, and then we kind of compared the different carbon crediting programs, how they perform against these criteria. So for example, whether they have a grievance mechanism in place, whether the impacts are monitored, whether there's third-party validation of the impacts of the projects, things like that. When the stakeholder consultation is conducted, is it conducted before the project is implemented or only afterwards? Like we try to identify kind of key criteria for the integrity, for the environmental and social safeguards integrity. Next slide. And so what we found is that, for example, the gold standard is really strong. Like the gold standard has a particular emphasis among the standards, I would say, on sustainable and development impact. So it fulfilled most criteria. And also, the Vera, which operates the VCS, they have developed complementary standards, the CCBS and SDG Star, and they also perform well. But Vera itself, the VCS, doesn't have so many safeguards. And also the CDM doesn't have so many safeguards. The CDM more relies on the host country. I mean, it's a different type of mechanism. It's a kind of a UN mechanism, and so the host country needs to say, yes, this is good, but it doesn't have so many own safeguards, and therefore it doesn't perform so well here. And also in terms of assessing sustainable development impacts, their gold standard and SDG Star fulfill many criteria. The CDM also has a SD tool, but it provides only limited assessment because Here, it only looks at possible positive impacts, but not at negative impacts. And so we identified a number of areas where we see that carbon crediting programs could improve. So they could also look more at negative impacts and not only positive impacts. It's important that, in our view, stakeholder consultations are conducted before project implementation, that there's monitoring and follow-up on the impacts, and that there are kind of specific safeguards being checked when a project is being developed. Then in the second part of the study, we assessed sustainable development impacts of certain project types. So we looked at afforestation, at improved cook stoves, off-grid PV and water filters. And we did so by evaluating the literature, but also consulting with many experts. And so overall, we found that these 4 selected project types have quite positive sustainable development impact. So about 1/3. So in the end, we selected 36 targets. Like under the SDG framework, you have the SDG goals, and then you have more than 150 targets under the SDG goals. And so we selected 36 targets, which we evaluated, and there were positive impacts on 1/3 to about half of these targets. And in particular for efficient cook stove projects, for example, there were quite positive impacts. There's also often quite a lot of uncertainty. So for example, for afforestation, it clearly depends how you do it, right? I mean, if you do a monoculture plantation, of course, the impacts are very different than if you do a local community project. Overall, there were few negative impacts identified and only in certain impacts. We found by doing that, we also had a number of cross-cutting findings, and in particular on methodology. We found that it's not so easy to do. Like in the end, you need to look to each specific project, but it was still very interesting to see like on what it depends, right? And like, for example, with afforestation, but also the time horizon, which you consider, like, do you also consider whether the solar PV panels are where they end up in the very end as a waste, etc. So it really matters on the specific context. And overall, I think a key recommendation from the study is when using projects in the voluntary carbon market to look for carbon crediting programs which have high standards, or to use them in combination. For example, the CDM can also be combined with the gold standard, or the VCS can be combined with SD Vista or the CCBS. And very lastly, I think the last slide, I hope, here's just one example. So how we did this for improved cook stoves. So for example, we identified 20 impacts, positive impacts on SDG targets, and a number of instances with varying impacts, and only very few SDG targets where there were no impacts. And of course, the impacts are quite well known. There's a lot of health improvements due to reduced particulate matter and other air pollutants, poverty reduction, benefits for women, reducing deforestation and forest degradation, improvement of energy efficiency. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Lambert, for this deep insight presentation concerning these parts, the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative as well as the study. We come now to you, Juan Pablo, and I may hand over the microphone to you for your presentation, Fairtrade Climate Standards and Opportunities for Increasing Transparency in Sustainable Development Contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for the presentations, also for my previous colleagues, and thank you for the invitation. Yeah, well, I will talk from the Fairtrade system on behalf of the Fairtrade system, and probably you will recognize the Fairtrade label, our brand, in whenever opportunity you have to search to buy bananas or coffee or chocolate bars. So we have this logo in our products. For Fairtrade, it's more than that. It's more a trade movement based on partnership between producers and consumers and workers. No? So what we do within Fairtrade, besides just having this label in the products, is setting standards. Standards for products, but also non-agricultural ones. And then what we are going to talk about today, the climate standard. But besides the climate standard, there's a set of around 11 criteria in other products related to environmental and climate aspects. So one of these goes directly to how we set prices. For Fairtrade products, there's always a minimum price based on cost of sustainable production, and there's a Fairtrade premium also associated with that. In some extent, we partner with our commercial partners in what we call offer to business to engage in other type of environmental and climate projects, developing initiatives together and doing advocacy campaigning as well. So the climate standard was inspired by the discussions in the voluntary market. So we know that in 1997, with the Kyoto Protocol, the CDM was there. And then in 2005, it was the origin of the voluntary markets, where people started to say, well, let's do something voluntarily. In that sense, in 2013, Fairtrade started to develop the thinking around developing a climate standard, and it was launched in Paris in 2015. At the moment, what the climate standard offers is an add-on on top of methodologies to make sure that we provide transparency and democratic decisions, a Fairtrade minimum price for the carbon credits, opportunity to invest in other type of climate adaptation projects, and capacity building with the communities, especially the climate standard focus on community-based organizations and smallholder producer organizations. And another aspect that are important, two of them, it's ensure right due diligence for human and environmental rights, and the concept of end buyer reduction. So avoid, reduce, and then compensate wherever possible. This part is interesting now in the discussions because we are talking here about supply chains, no, value chains, and for a commercial partners, there's protocols for emission 1 and emission 2, no scopes, no. But it's for them quite difficult to understand scope 3 emissions because scope 3 emissions relate to those indirect emissions that come from sourcing. So if imagine a company here in Germany trying to avoid emissions from all the coffee that they source from Uganda, they have to know what is the emission factor in Uganda and then understand that and add that to the carbon accounting. Those protocols are still, for the private sector, very difficult to scale. So again, as I was explaining, the next one, please. Fairtrade started in 2015, the discussion. At that moment, we did a benchmark analysis, and we found that the gold standard was the standard that provide most assurance. We did that benchmark. And after that, we signed the cooperation agreement with the gold standard. So all the Fairtrade carbon credit projects are actually gold standard. It's a kind of an add-on on top of them. So we have the project activities and then the emission reduction, the type of CDM mechanism using the methodologies of the IPCC. And then gold standard issue the projects, confirm that the emissions are actually what they are saying, and we come on top of them to make sure that there's transparency and democratic decisions and ensure the minimum price. We have, the next one, please. The structure of the minimum price set per the cost of implementing the technology, and then what is there for the producers or the producers of this carbon credit. So we have the implementation cost plus the project cost plus the carbon cost plus the business margin minus the revenues. We do that to establish a minimum price and ensure that there's at least the cost of the technology secured, and there's some extra benefits for these communities. And there's another aspect here that we call the premium for carbon credits, and this is €1 extra on the minimum price that is there for be used in adaptation purposes. Interesting to say, we did an analysis, an impact assessment, this year, and one of the findings of this is that we were considered very expensive because we were actually measuring all the costs of implementing technologies. So the issue of scale versus prices still in the market is something that we have to discuss further. Next one, please. At the moment, well, it has been 7 years more or less. We have projects, not much. I would like to have more to share, but we have projects in Peru. This is a really interesting one in the Sierra and Sierra of Piura. It's a reforestation project. We have projects in India with biogas installations. Actually, one of them went to the CDM, moved from voluntary to official markets. And then projects in Lesotho, Uganda, Ethiopia, Burkina Faso. The one in Ethiopia is one that I really like because it's a smallholder producer organization that are sourcing coffee, but the households are the one implementing these cook stoves, and I'm going to refer that a little bit more later. So these projects, next one please. Some of the outreach so far, again, are certified emissions, but also mostly very voluntary emission reductions and projected emission reductions. And when I'm talking about projected emission reductions, this is another lesson from dealing with private sector. No? Most of these projected emissions, for instance, reforestation projects, takes a commitment of 10, 15, 20 years. No? You need to project the emissions over time, and for commercial partners, they want to see the emission reductions now. So it's difficult to engage in the conversation for long-term relations with commercial partners, and some of them are more willing. But that's again what I was referring at the beginning about the Fairtrade principle of building those partnerships. So if the partnership is strong, there's a commercial partner interested in offset their emissions, they will be more willing to invest in projected emissions or invest in long-time commitments. The projects that I was referring is a bit more than 650,000 CO2 equivalents, over 7 million euros generated in sales, 450,000 in premiums. So this at least, well, again, I would like to see more, but we are learning by implementing this with a reach of more than 66,000 households. The type of projects, again, are gold standard issued, and we are doing energy efficiency, renewable energy, and reforestation at this moment. And the average price of 1 ton of carbon credits is between 12 and 17 euros per ton. Next one, please. Well, I was saying before that one of the reasons why we engaged with the gold standard was actually their protocols for sustainable development goals. The projects that that I show, the ones in Peru and India and Lesotho, etc., at least from our statistics, are contributing to 11 SDGs. One clear example is, for instance, in improved cooks facility. This is probably not new for most of you, but an improved cook stove allows a household to reduce the consumption of wood from the bushes. Therefore, most of these actions are taken care by the women in the household. So there's a cool connection with SDG 5, gender equality, about empowering them, empowering the women in at the household level. But there's other connections with zero hunger and reducing inequalities and responsible consumption, especially because we are talking mostly about trading goods also. So it's trading carbon credits, but also trading coffee, banana, cocoa. But to increase the demand, we need to identify more projects, and then the issue of credibility is an important one. Next one, please. So again, some of the evidence of what I'm referring about this connection between what we want to achieve in offering carbon credits in the market and the link with other co-benefits or links with under poverty or empowering communities is, again, you can read it, I will not read it, but take some learnings back to us that it's very needy to unlock unfairness in the climate discussion because most of the producers in, let's say, the tropics are more front of the climate discussion. Therefore, there's no one-side responsibility. You know? We have to engage with the different partners along the supply chain. And for that, Scope 3 emissions are important also to make proper carbon accounting. Adaptation is as equal as important as mitigation. So that's also the rationale we have in our minds now, how to move from just mitigation projects and then shape the climate standard into also a facility for adaptation. And then the ownership of the projects per se, the carbon projects per se, how we ensure that the carbon credits can empower communities. This is another part of the rationale connected to the economic benefits for these communities. We understand that the carbon market is very complex, especially when we are dealing with commercial partners and try to promote offsetting emissions. Most of them are more keen to do insetting, actually, to do it outside the market and say, okay, let me just do my accounting and be responsible for that. I don't want to deal with the paperwork of the structural market, but then that's part of the conversation. No? And the other part of the conversation is the prices. So to conclude, the three main messages that I have now and in the conversations with my colleagues, quote, we are going to review the climate standard this year. It's going to be a public analysis, so welcome all the feedback that you have for us to improve. But three main things that I have in mind when in this process of reviewing the climate standard is building more community-based innovations, how to move ahead in methodologies that can provide innovations on the bottom in the communities. The second is connect mitigation with adaptation, how to manage carbon facilities that also incorporate adaptation. So for instance, nature-based solutions is something that we are looking very closely. Actually, I'm engaged in conversations with IUCN for the Global Facility for Nature-Based Solutions with the intention to move from standards to certifications. And finally, how to look from the demand side, the commercial partners, and how they see they are keen to invest in this type of initiatives, but how to make it suitable for them also to engage in their projections and in their business offer. So those are a couple of ideas that I want to share with you all, and I will be happy to respond to any question later. So thank you.
Thank you, Pablo, for your contribution. And I may now open the discussion. And please feel free, ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to ask some questions. The lady right here in the middle was the first, then here, and then right there. Please.
I guess there's no.
No, you don't need any microphone.
Okay.
No, for the recording.
Oh, I just heard that we need a microphone for the streaming audience. And if you start asking your question, please briefly say for which organization you are here. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for the presentations. My name is Nadine Planzer. I work for SustainCert. We're the official certification body for Gold Standard. So obviously these conversations are very interesting for me. I have questions for probably all of the panel members. So let me just start with Miguel. Hold on. So Miguel, you talked about that the supply of credits you think is going to be hampered because of, let's say, the lack of corresponding adjustments being implemented by governments. Could you maybe just explain a little bit more why you think that will happen? You know, we get a tremendous amount of requests coming in at SustainCert to develop projects from all sectors, from corporates to NGOs to governments. So let's say at this point we do not see a decrease in inquiries and demand to develop. We see that the problem is mostly with that there's not enough expertise with these newbies, let's say, who want to develop projects. Also, when it comes to verification, there's a lack of subject matter experts, and there's bottlenecks when it comes to reviewing projects, etc. So we see the bottlenecks a little bit slightly in different areas. So if you could just elaborate on that, that would be great. Should I just continue with some of the questions for the other members, or should we? Ask your question. Yeah. Okay. And then I had a question. Let's say for sorry, this is not. Why is this not moving up? I want to see your name. Femke. Just wondering, what are your, how was your experience developing mangrove projects? I know they're quite new, the methodology. So if you could just elaborate on, what are the challenges that you faced and some of the bottlenecks when developing a project? Be keen to hear that. Dr. Lambert, Carbon Credit Quality Initiative, it's very interesting, the work that you're doing. I'm wondering how you assessed the SDG impacts, like what indicators did you use? And also what your thoughts about aggregating SDG impact to national levels, because obviously the projects have an SDG impact, everyone claims SDG impacts, they just say these are it. How do you aggregate that to actual, the global targets? If you have some thoughts about that. Yeah, I think that was it. Juan, I'd like to speak to you afterwards. I actually developed the Oromia project as well with Fair Climate Fund. So.
If you don't mind, we start with the first three questions, and then, because there are some other ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Miguel, Femke, and then Lambert, you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's actually a very good question. Maybe I would have, it was better if I nuanced it a little bit. So the statement that there might be less willingness from governments to authorize credits in this case or projects because they will be reflected as an increase in their national inventory is in direct comparison with the CDM, right? In the CDM world, this didn't apply, so they were simply no consequences, only benefits, so to speak, if you approved CDM projects. Now, you have the benefits of sustainable development benefits, mobilization finance, etc., but you will have to pay a price in the corresponding adjustment in your inventory. Now, it's good to hear that so far you don't see that. I think it's voluntary market, right? Of course, we still have to see how Article 6 takes off. But good to hear about that's not yet, I mean, it cannot be yet a bottleneck. We will need to see how it takes off. But I think the issue is going to be one of balance between the impact on increasing your inventory and the benefit that you get for doing that, right? So in the end, pricing. If the price is right, then governments might be more willing to authorize the projects than if the prices are lower, right? And on the capacity building, just to say, this was always a challenge for us on the CDM as well, finding enough verifiers, especially for developing nations and some developing areas in particular, and having local capacity also for the development of the PDDs, of the design of the projects, has always been a challenge. About the regional distribution has always been a discussion under the CDM. So definitely that is being taken. Well, we are looking forward to try to address that from the start. That the COP already mandated that there will be capacity building in collaboration with our regional collaboration centers, so that we start helping developing nations prepare for the new mechanisms. That's already started. So hopefully that will help a little bit, maybe also on the voluntary market side.
Okay, Femke.
Thank you for your question. So you asked about the challenges that we face in setting up and implementing mangrove projects. But maybe I just start with wetland projects in general, because we have experience mainly in peat swamp projects, very large scale, in Indonesia and actually also Russia. And these projects are complex because they have a huge scale, so they are over 150,000 hectares, for example, typically. They involve many stakeholders. We operate in a setting with competing claims and understanding, and of course also very dynamic policy setting. And the complexity then is to have all stakeholders on board to do joint visioning and project development and design. And then there's, in the context of the voluntary carbon market, on top of that, all the administration and technical aspects of accounting and reporting. And we are currently also scoping blue carbon projects. And what we see there is that mangroves are fringe habitats, so they don't have a similar scale to peat swamp forest, for example. So if you're looking for a site of 100,000 hectares, that's difficult to find. And also these coastal environments have even more, they're more crowded spaces. So if you want to achieve this big scale, which used to be required also because the prices were not, wouldn't be viable, the carbon price was quite low, so you would need economies of scale. But now we see the price going up, so there, especially for blue carbon, so then there's more possible. And also we're now looking at, more a landscape approach, where you not only look at the mangroves, but look at source to sea, so you also involve the landscape behind that, but then it becomes more complex because you need to combine several methodologies, because every intervention has its own methodology. And we're now looking into simplifying that and to finding our way, and setting up a landscape guidance, also in collaboration with Vera, to see if we can navigate through the methodologies at landscape scale. So from a project perspective, I think it's very important to achieve quality and to think about all the elements that safeguard quality. But on the other hand, it can also become so complex that quality comes at a huge expense, and all your attention is dedicated to the paperwork rather than to the actual action on the ground. So we have to be careful not to be overly precise on that. I hope that answers your question.
I think definitely for the first step, yeah? Okay, Lambert.
Yeah, thank you. You were asking about how we assess the sustainable development goals or the impacts. So we used a methodology developed by Stockholm Environment Institute, where you basically have a scale from -3 to +3, depending on the nature of how it impacts the SDG, right? So we took the SDG goals and then we looked at specific targets, and each target we gave a grading from -3 to +3 depending on the characteristic of the impact, right? And we did the same in the study for the foundation and in the CCQI, so we used the same methodology. And sometimes it proved to be difficult, but I think it's a relatively easy and good framework. And then under CCQI, we just added up the points. And then, of course, that's very arbitrary. Like we said, okay, you need a certain number of points to get a score of 5, a certain number of points to get a score of 4. But of course, that's arbitrary. But that's always, like, we want to show the differences, but they are relative, right? And where you set the threshold, that's always an arbitrary decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Lambert. And now the questions of the lady here in the first row.
Hello, is this working? Okay, perfect. Thank you, everybody, for the presentations. I really think it was really interesting. My name is Benja Fex. I recently graduated from Wageningen University. I did climate studies, and I did my thesis on the evolution of sustainable development in the VCM. I interviewed you last year, so nice to see you in person. I have a lot of questions, but I'm also only gonna do 3. For Miguel, I think it's really interesting to see that the pricing of carbon is one thing for why the VCM is existing, but also if you look back at like really the beginning, then you know that like the development policy and climate policy has always been connected, because it came forth from climate CSR ambitions. But I was wondering let me have a look. Yeah, on the fact that carbon neutrality is now a claim that everybody knows, right? I was recently at a webinar by the Carbon Market Watch, and they are quite big critics of that term, and they say that it's really complex. You know, nobody understands really what net zero and carbon neutrality means. And I'm also more of an advocate for, you know, getting rid of that term. But I was wondering, because there's like two camps, and how can we make peace? So that I wanted to hear your view on that. And Lambert, I have a question for you. I also recently worked on SDG to project level translation. I think it's a really difficult task. So I was wondering, like, where do you draw the line between what are safeguards, avoided negative impacts, and what are actual positive contributions to sustainable development? So like, Femke, also your mitigation graph was super interesting, and you know, where's that line where you see that something's actually good and not avoiding the bad? And my third question is for
Of course.
Thank you. Yeah, the gold standard is requiring project developers to report to at least 3 SDGs, right? So how can you avoid just naming SDGs because you have to, and the risks that come along with that? Thank you.
Okay, first Miguel and then Lambert.
Yes, thank you. This is a big discussion that is going on in every single forum where the topic of voluntary climate action, including carbon markets, is mentioned. Let me say, I see the claim of carbon neutrality only as a tool to encourage voluntary users to financially contribute to making these projects happen. This is what matters in the end, is mobilizing the finance that makes the Fairtrade or the Gold Standard, VC, Verra, etc. projects happen. It's a tool that allows in particular the corporate sector to justify the investment, right? If you run a company and you're asked to contribute to a climate protection project, how do you justify it to your shareholders? I'm putting money outside of the company, outside of the value chain, for saving the planet and making doing what is right. That doesn't really work in the corporate sector. So, but if you say I'm compensating my emissions, I'm a carbon neutral company, or I have a carbon neutral product that brings additional reputational benefits or marketing in a way, then they have a rationale for investing, right? So that is the value of the concept of carbon neutral or net zero, positive, negative, whatever they are. So I think it should continue because of this reason. However, what we need is the very clear rules for making those claims credible. So how do you estimate your carbon footprint exactly, right? Which sources have to be included? Which methodology has to be used? Then how much are you reducing? What are your targets? Are you really making progress toward those targets or not? And finally, making sure that the credits that you use at the end are credible, as we heard today. So as long as you have good guidance and you are following that guidance, then the carbon neutral claim would be very useful. Now, can we eliminate it and actually say, I estimate my footprint, I am reducing it, and then I'm also contributing beyond my value chain? Yeah, that could be done. But again, my question would be, how does that, or how the corporate will justify to their shareholders putting that money outside of the value chain, right? As long as there is no clear recognition or wider recognition that this is something really good that can also add to your reputation, it's difficult, right? And again, carbon neutral is a term, either we like it or not, it's a term that has become now popular. People understand more or less what it means. It means that you're doing something for climate. Now we just have to make sure that someone is checking that that something is real, right, and done correctly.
Thank you, Miguel. I think Lambert will also slightly touch this question as well. Lambert, your turn.
Yeah, maybe first, So to the SDG impact, so in the study which we conducted for the foundation, we indeed often have a range for a number of criteria where we say depending on the project, it can be from -1 to +2, right? So sometimes it's not so easy to say, is it positive or negative? But how most carbon crediting standards work is they have kind of safeguard provisions on the one hand to say, okay, it shouldn't do any harm, any significant harm. And then they have a whole system to say, okay, let's monitor all the impacts, including the positive ones and the negative ones. And kind of this is two different rule sets under standards. And so we also separated our assessment according to these two different rule sets. On the one hand, the environmental and social safeguards, and on the other hand, kind of quantification of whatever the impacts are. Maybe a few words to these debates. Like, I think in the end what matters is what the atmosphere sees from that action, right? If a voluntary carbon credit buyer finances a project, etc. And what we did is we did a study for the Environmental Agency in Germany where we looked into different scenarios, right? And what we found is it really depends. So I don't think that one or the other camp in this debate is right or wrong, but the issue is in some scenarios, if you claim neutrality, you may actually do not see an emission reduction to the atmosphere, even if your credit has perfect quality, because it displaces mitigation action which otherwise the country would do. But that doesn't apply to all scenarios. You can also construct scenarios where this doesn't apply, and even if the host country and the buyer claims the credits, you still see a reduction to the atmosphere. And I think that's the difficulty in which we are. And I mean, my personal view is, given that you have this uncertainty, the safer way is to kind of say, okay, I change the type of claim, I go to contribution claim, or I say I need the corresponding adjustments. It's kind of the more conservative approach where you could argue, okay, you have this uncertainty, you don't know, it's even beyond the control of the buyers and beyond the control of the project developers because it depends on the behavior of the host country, right? And if you want to be on the conservative side, you take that position, but that, of course, as Miguel said, can also lower the volume of the market. And so other people argue, well, if that makes the market to die, then what is the usefulness of that? So I'm just trying to summarize the debate, right? But it's difficult. I think in the long term, in my personal opinion, it would be really good if companies move away from the claim of greenhouse gas neutrality or carbon neutrality and say we do something for the climate and this is what we do, and you have contribution claims. I think it's more sincere in my personal view, and they transparently communicate this is our remaining emissions, but we take action and we finance that. But that doesn't mean that this product which I sell is necessarily climate neutral. That's my personal view on it, but there are different views. And I wouldn't say I'm right, it's just my personal view. Thank you.
Okay, I think the questions are answered so far. Femke? Something
to add?
Small contributions?
Well, I just wanted to reflect on what Lambert says, because it's indeed, your last remark. If we would undermine the market, then you can be very conservative, but in the end, we also need the markets to finance action. And for wetlands, if we delay this for 10 more years, struggling for the highest quality, then we will lose many of them, which we cannot afford if we want to have the 1.5 degree target. So I do think that we need to work a lot on. So we have the quality, integrity. What's the name? The carbon. Sorry. So that's on the supply side, but we need to have that on the demand side as well. I would love to have this kind of scoring, and then you could also paint a nuanced picture, like, okay, this claim means this and this and this, and that would bring a lot of clarity. So I think we need great steps there, but it shouldn't delay action. We really need action now. So.
That's the main important, yes. My role is to moderate, and your turn now.
Thank you very much. My name is Marianne Peters from Maastricht University. I'm a professor of environmental policy and law. Thank you so much for organizing this. I've gained a lot of knowledge, and I have two follow-up questions, I think. One is about the ranking of the carbon credit programs. Very nice idea, very nice presentation on that. But I wondered, is it possible then to examine what it means for the prices? We are after all talking about carbon markets, voluntary carbon markets, so it's also about prices. But I have no knowledge myself to what extent there is transparency on the prices to be paid. So is that still quite confidential? And would it be possible also then to see if you have different scales in trustworthiness, etc., of the offset programs, whether that translates also in different prices or not? And that perhaps then also links to the observation reflection from Femke that there needs also to be more reflection on the demand side. And there, of course, then on the demand side, you could also say, well, I am willing to pay a higher price for more solid programs. Related to that, I also wonder the price dimension. I think there are so many different wetlands. As a simple lawyer, I imagine that, so that the price difference is also very relevant for the projects that you do. That's the first question. Second question, to keep it brief, that's very fundamental. That's on how to translate indeed it to the Sustainable Development Goals. And I really see the nice pictures of the cook stoves, that's fantastic. But if we then take one step back and think about, for instance, reducing inequality, is it then still sustainable simply to buy off carbon emissions for the rich people taking flights, knowing that then cook stoves are financed? So if we take it very fundamental, if we do not do a methodological plus or minus approach on how to translate the SDGs, but if we really take a step back, how sustainable is that rich people can continue with certain behavior that could easily be avoided by offsetting it? So would that be something to take up as well? And that's again the demand side then. So for what is it used? And according to my knowledge, the European Union in its laws has said, well, we are going to do domestic emissions, no offsetting at this moment. So do you see any chance to convince the EU, perhaps at a certain moment, to get engaged again with offsetting? And then perhaps such considerations need to be done for what can it then be used to offsets? Those are my questions. Thank you very much. Great work.
Thank you. And I think the first question was mainly directed to Dr. Lambert and the second to Miguel or Juan Pablo. Yeah. Okay. Your turn.
Yeah, thank you. Prices, that's really an interesting question. So you can buy carbon credits from 30 euro cent to 1,000 US dollar. And you see transactions in that range, of course, rarely the 1,000 US dollar, but that's really the price span. And I would say, yes, there's some differentiation. So for example, if projects have lots of sustainable development co-benefits, generally, on average, these projects achieve higher prices. But there's a great, well, it's not completely intransparent, like you have reports which publish average prices for different project types, but generally, you also see sometimes projects which I would rate quite bad going over the counter for 30 euro and quite good projects going over the counter for much less, right? So I wouldn't say it's a really transparent price building mechanism. And of course, you have some exchanges where you have kind of standardized contracts being exchanged, and then you have one price, right? But at these exchanges, the prices are very low. Like all CRs, you can trade them at ICE in Europe. It's a liquided market, but the price is 50 cents or something like that, right? Because everything is eligible. And in Singapore, also prices at $1, etc. Like there are different exchanges, but there the prices are really low. one aim of the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market is to kind of identify credits which fulfill higher quality standards and to have these as standardized contracts being exchanged. And so the expectation would be that they will have higher prices. Whether that materializes, we will need to see, but that's the aim, right? Okay, maybe I stop here. Yeah.
Femke may
Yeah,
do a little contribution as well.
on the pricing, because you asked about wetland interventions, and of course there's a range of interventions, and the costs depend on the type of intervention and also on the country and the amount of stakeholders that needs to be engaged. But what we often now see is that the costs are barely covered by the costs that we have to actually come to a carbon project are often higher than what we can get back. And I also think that there is like this low-hanging fruit that where you can restore or conserve wetlands for quite a low price. But if the price goes up, then the range of options becomes, of course, much bigger. And I think it's very important that a fair price is being paid that at least covers the costs. And of course, also there's much talk about benefit sharing and meaningful engagement of stakeholders. And that also has a price. So is there benefit or revenue sharing possible?
Well, coming to the second question, we may start with Pablo and then Miguel.
Sure. Yeah, your question is very valid. I mean, it's connected also with the other discussion we had about claiming carbon neutrality. No, there are actually legal implications for companies that are claiming not carbon neutrality because it can be seen as a false attribution. So as a consumer, I could eventually sue a company because they are claiming something that is not correct. It's what I was referring about proper due diligence. You know? It's not just, well, let's do the projects, yes, but also make sure that there's a transaction that is fair and ethical around, and then your claim and the communications that you use as a trader to communicate that back forward with your consumers is actually truth. No? Otherwise, there might be, or there eventually be, legal implications with such type of claims. No? We know that because we have confronted this not only for the carbon credits, but also for the bananas and the coffee and the chocolate bars, etc. And in our climate standard, there's this particular chapter about end buyers. What is the purpose of purchasing these carbon credits? And again, follows the same principles: avoid, reduce, compensate. So for those that wants to compensate over 1,000 tons of Fairtrade carbon credits, they need to follow some protocols. They need to follow either the ICEO 9004 protocol or the greenhouse gas protocol as well. And that's what I was referring also about a true methodology or a proper methodology for Scope 3 emissions. Actually, with SustainCert, we have been working closely on that because in my conversations with commercial partners, they say, well, okay, yeah, I want to offset my emissions. I'm going to do my Scope 1 analysis and reduce as much as possible, but I still need to source these flowers from Kenya. So there's going to be a footprint involved there. And it's interesting to see the case for flowers. So if I take more time here in answering, but we did a comparison analysis about flowers produced in Europe, especially the Netherlands, compared to Fairtrade flowers produced in Nairobi, in Kenya, in Naivasha Lake. And the footprint of our producers, our flowers in Kenya were lower because of the increment in use of the inefficient use of energy for greenhouses in the production of these flowers in the Netherlands. So it's a very weird discussion. It requires true data. I think that the issue of collecting the right data to make the analysis of your footprint and have that, let's say, validated or at least issued, verified, and be accountable for that. That's the main principle behind that. Is part of also the justice that we are claiming in the climate discussion. No? Because it's not fair to just say, okay, we are doing these projects in the tropical regions while here in the north we continue doing our emissions the same way. No? So we try to put those things in our standard and engage in the conversation with the companies. Not always easy, but something that we try to move forward. So I don't know if Miguel, you want to complement something?
Yes, we're almost out of time, right? So just very quickly to say that, yes, the compensation of emissions or carbon markets are just one element of a much bigger ecosystem, right? So definitely those more affluent need to change the way they behave. How do we do that? I think the main way is carbon pricing, and we need a price signal. When it gets too expensive to fly, much more expensive than buying one carbon credit, then people will consider if they continue flying so much or not. So the carbon markets is just one element, one tool to help us address climate change, but we need so many other policies and changes. Carbon pricing, I think, is one of the key ones.
Thank you, Miguel. I'm really very sorry, but we have a very strict timetable and we have to come to an end. I may thank you very much and really a warm thanks to my distinguished colleagues here in the table, as well as to the exciting and very engaged audience here in the room. And I'm absolutely convinced that it's the same on the net as well. At the very beginning, at the very end, I would like to add some little remark. We were here discussing the connection between the SDGs and the carbon credits. And I think, as I said at another stage, closing disparities in the world and following up the goals of the Agenda 2030 is climate protection as well, and I think this is the main and the big picture we shouldn't forget. Thank you very much. Thank you for your engagement. Keep on action and have a good day.